The subject today is othering. And othering is the vilification of groups of people based on who they are, and it is a driver of authoritarian ambition and success. It is a political strategy used by those who want to build power for their own purposes and not for the American people. What is so insidious about this is it's now being framed in American patriotism and protection. The dehumanization of people in this country is not new. Slavery, Jim Crow, anti-Semitism, past and present, internment camps, and those who are not wealthy and yearn for the freedom and promise that this country offers. Both public and private sector infrastructure supports this othering. Think about it. It's a media framework, legal frameworks, electoral rules, the shunning of empathy as a virtue by some, and a compliant Supreme Court. All of this results in behavior that can be unspeakably cruel and outside the bounds of our Constitution and basic American values. So why is othering so strong and so successful? Our brains are hardwired to categorize, stereotype, and determine whether we need to fight or flee. So we organize ourselves by in-groups and out-groups, with out-groups being potentially threatening to our status, our sense of identity, and our place in the American culture. So those in the outgroups apparently are responsible for crime, job loss, cultural decline, threats to our national security, and the inability of everyday Americans to make it in this country. Some are able to justify the cruelest behavior by becoming morally disengaged. And so cruelty and injustice are somehow deserved or necessary or just, frankly, ignored. Othering really thrives on hardship and uncertainty and the need to make sense of it all by blaming others or wishing for a strong man who would just fix it or change it or shake things up. So here we are. Tearing our country apart through othering is a foundational challenge. We must understand it and address it. It's too costly, and it must be stopped, this effort to divide one American from another. So this is the goal of Innovating for the Public Goods Research Strategy. It's in 3 parts, and we want to understand how to counter the division of othering and its path to power by those who do not care much about Americans, everyday Americans. So we're going to have a presentation by Hart Research, and then Erica Williams is going to be our fantastic moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Paige. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Corey Hunt. I'm joined by Jeff Guerin and London Wagner. Believe you can see my screen, but let me know if not.
Not yet, Corey.
Okay.
Now I've got it.
It should
Thank
be
you.
there. Okay.
Yep.
All right. So I'll be talking about the findings from our new national survey of nearly 2,700 registered voters conducted on behalf of PSG Consulting. We included in this an oversample of nearly 800 young voters, ages 18 to 29. So I'll mention those today. We also have a separate deck that you can look at linked in the invitation. And as Paige mentioned, othering and grouping people into in-groups and out-groups and us versus them, it's not a new phenomenon. It's a tactic authoritarian leaders have long used to weaken democratic norms and manipulate people. It's moved in and out of the margins and very much in the center of political strategy under Trump and the far right. And we're seeing it play out in anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-trans legislation, direct attacks on democratic institutions. So the research I'm going to be presenting today is the first phase, very diagnostic of the current moment. We'll also talk about how we can respond strategically, and that's something we'll be really digging into in the next phase of the work. So to start, to understand how othering takes hold, we need to look at 2 things: what people value and what they think is going wrong. So most voters share core values like freedom and family, and there is broad agreement that the wealthy are gaining power while working people are losing it. But beyond that, people are deeply divided on what's causing the country's problems today. And that's really where othering comes in. It gives people someone to blame for their feelings of dissatisfaction, anxiety, and concern. So to start, we asked voters what values they believe America should stand for. Freedom is one value that truly unites Harris and Trump voters. You can see these are the results split out by Trump and Harris voters here. But after freedom, their priorities split. Trump voters lean heavily on patriotism, Christian values, while Harris voters lean more on democracy and human rights. There's these deeper value differences have implications for how people respond to threats and aspirational messages. Freedom messages, freedom language is likely to resonate across the board. That's something we've been seeing for years. But if you're talking about threats to democracy or human rights, that's going to connect more with the left. Patriotism and Christian values move Trump voters, but tend to fall more flat with people on the left. So this does start to give us a roadmap for what kinds of appeals, what kinds of values have power with different parts of the electorate. And beyond how people feel about the country, we wanted to understand what shapes their personal identity, because that fundamentally shapes who they see as us versus them. So across the board, we had them rate these different parts or aspects of identity for how important it was to them personally. Family is the top one. It's core to how people define their in-group and themselves, how they interpret societal change, how they decide what matters. What does this mean for my family? For Trump voters, being American Christian comes next. And then for people's race and their ethnicity, you can see is far more central to Harris voters of color than it is for Trump voters of color. And then one other striking finding here is that political identity ranks much lower, even among those Trump voters. You can see on the far right, few are defining themselves primarily by their politics. That's not to say that is important. It obviously is, but their fundamental way they like to see and talk about themselves is through family, faith, and national identity as these powerful touch points for Trump voters. And when we're countering othering and thinking about how to counter othering, these are important levers to tap into, because it informs both how they perceive threats, what they find threatening, and also what they feel protective of. Before we get into the specific attitudes on social issues, it's just important to know where we're starting from. So across the board, there's deep unease about how society is changing. 7 in 10 voters say it's gotten worse over the past 10 to 20 years. That includes Harris voters, Trump voters, young people, everyone. People may not agree on what it means to be changing for the worse, but that sense of decline creates an opening for scapegoating and for othering. And one of the clearest points of consensus that we found in this survey of many differences was on that what is getting worse across the electorate is the wealthy are gaining power and working class Americans are losing it. So Democrats, Republicans, younger and older people all see rising wealth inequality. There's a sense of frustration, and that sort of frustration creates really fertile ground for othering, because when people feel like they're losing ground and they can't challenge the most powerful, it becomes easier to turn people against each other. And we saw that in the data. We asked the same question about lots of different demographic groups. And we saw Trump voters believe LGBTQ people, women, Black people are all gaining power, while white people and Christians are losing power. And Harris voters believe the opposite. But this was one area where everyone agreed that wealth inequality, the wealthy Americans are gaining power while working class Americans are losing it. Well, there's one caveat to that last point, which is there was some consensus about people themselves feeling like they are losing power. When we asked very directly, do you feel like you or people like you are losing or gaining power? Most people are more likely to say they feel like they are losing power. It's not as extreme as working class people losing power, but there is still this feeling of a downward trajectory. Even MAGA Trump voters, only 20% think they're gaining power, while 31% say they're losing it. Evangelicals feel that loss of power even more acutely. And then we have among Harris voters, higher rates of feeling like they're losing power, especially women, Black women. That sense of loss is even sharper. So there's this really widespread feeling, not just of wealth inequality, but that people themselves are losing power. So what is actually bothering people? What do they believe are our biggest societal problems? We asked voters to rate 16 different cultural and social concerns. And there's one area where Trump and Harris voters agree, and that is that crime is a major problem. But beyond that, there are dramatic differences between Harris and Trump voters. For Trump voters, who are in the red on this slide, the biggest concerns are the perceived loss of family values, faith, and patriotism. We've already seen those are deeply tied to their identity and their worldview. They're also alarmed by what they see as teachers indoctrinating children with leftist ideology, and also efforts to change traditional definitions of gender. Harris voters largely don't share those concerns, but it's not a clean break. About 4 in 10 Harris voters say the loss of family values and the rise of socialism and communism in the US are big problems, but by and large, they are focused on other things. And it's very clear Harris and Trump voters are seeing the country through very different moral frameworks. So what do Harris voters see as the biggest problems? Aside from crime, which I mentioned, their top concerns are the rise of right-wing extremism, the rights of women being taken away, and the rise of white nationalism, with at least 64% saying that these are a very big problem in the country today. And these concerns also shape how they think about immigration, racial injustice, and systemic discrimination, which you can see are also rated as much higher problems for Harris voters than for Trump voters. When it comes to gender, Harris voters are far more concerned about the loss of women's rights than on rising extreme forms of masculinity. That's down at the bottom. And so that framing really does matter. And then Trump voters largely dismiss these concerns. There is one exception, which is 43% of Trump voters say the loss of women's rights is a big problem. And I'll come back to that because that is a notable point where Trump's rhetoric and actions have gone through too far for even some of his base. We do believe that young voters can lead the way in pushing back against othering. Voters under 30 are more concerned than older voters about discrimination against immigrants, women, and Black Americans. They're less likely to buy into right-wing narratives. You can see just 35% of young voters say that immigrants want to change America instead of adapting to American traditions is a big problem for the country. They're also far less concerned about so-called woke ideology, but that doesn't mean that they are disconnected from traditional values. And in fact, that one, the loss of family, faith, and patriotism is still perceived as a big problem for just over half, 53% of young voters. And it is one of the few things that younger men cared about in general. They were relatively less concerned about everything we asked about in the survey, but this was one area that did activate younger men. So now that we've covered the big picture backdrop, we want to look at how othering shows up on very specific issues, starting with immigration. Trump's approach is very much in line with his MAGA base, but it does go too far for much of the electorate. And the cruelty and constant framing of immigrants as a threat is seen as out of step with much of the country today. So as I just mentioned, that young people are especially important for pushing back against othering. That's especially true when it comes to immigrants. When we asked voters to choose between two common narratives, voters under age 30 overwhelmingly side with immigrants. So we have nearly twice as many saying that immigrants who came to America to build a better life are being mistreated, is their point of view, versus too many immigrants want to change America instead of adapting to American traditions. And then on the right side of the graph, you see similar results when testing right-wing attacks that claims that immigrants bring crime or take government handouts. Younger voters reject these frames. Older voters are more evenly split. But even among older voters, there's definitely room to push back. Harris supporters break, as you would expect, very much with the blue bars on this slide, but independents lean much more towards defending immigrants on these same questions as well. We also see Trump is clearly vulnerable on immigration. He has lost ground on what was once a political strength for him, especially due to his harsh rhetoric and disregard for due process. We see 58% of voters say he's out of step with their views. When we ask why in an open end, they point directly to his treatment and rhetoric against immigrants, as well as his disregard for due process. But the challenge is, if you look at the right side of the slide, voters don't see Democrats as aligned with their views either. In fact, 52% say the Democratic Party leaders are out of step with their views, and then they explain in the open ends their concerns about open borders, weak enforcement of the border, and then also, very importantly, from an othering perspective, a perception that Democratic Party leaders are prioritizing immigrants over citizens. So these are longstanding Republican narratives, and they have taken hold, not just with the right, but with independents and swing voters as well. Trump's deportation agenda specifically is more of a political liability than a political winner. It's underwater. 48% are unfavorable to it compared to just 39% favorable. There's definitely room to drive that unfavorable number up higher, especially with independents. You can see 23% are holding out, don't have an opinion, or not sure. But then when you look at his own voters, MAGA voters support it, but 19% of non-MAGA voters are still undecided. So again, potential opening. And then younger voters are especially opposed and unfavorable to this at the bottom of the slide. So again, there's a real opportunity to push back here, particularly with young voters. And Trump's disregard for due process is already showing up as a liability. Voters mentioned it in their open ends, unprompted, when explaining how he's out of step with their own views. But that backlash really intensifies when they believe deportations are targeting people with deep roots to the country. So we did the split form test. When we do this, voters were 24 points more likely to say that it's bad for the country than good when longtime undocumented immigrants are deported without due process. Compare that to the graph on the left, which is at -14, when we do not mention the length of residency in the US and just refer to due process. And then you can look at the right slide. This is breaking out the difference in that net, the good minus bad, among different subgroups, and the difference for the impact of including the length of residency in the US is especially stark when you look at independents. They go from -10 to -39. When length of residency is included, we see similar movement among white voters and young men. And in fact, when we specify the longtime residents, men under 30 look a lot more, or they look exactly like women under 30, whereas they weren't quite as concerned when we didn't mention that the undocumented immigrants had been in the US for many years. While Trump is overplaying his hand on immigration. He does have more traction, and right-wing people have more traction with transgender othering, especially when the conversation is connected to kids' sports or redefining gender. We have a significant number of voters, including Harris supporters, some, not all certainly, but agree with him on this issue. And while this survey specifically didn't go really deep into transgender narratives, others are doing important work there. But what we do find in the questions we asked about it is that shifting the conversation towards being about transgender people's freedom to live and express themselves, and tying it back to that core American value of freedom is more sympathetic and effective terrain for us. So we asked this Pew question here in our survey, asking voters how far society has gone on transgender issues. 4 in 9 say we've gone too far to accommodate transgender people. Only 27% say we haven't gone far enough. The view that we've gone too far is strongest among MAGA Trump voters, but the more revealing divide is within the Democratic coalition. So a majority of liberal Harris voters at 58% say we haven't gone far enough, but more moderate and conservative Harris voters are split. And then among young voters, there's a clear gender gap. Young women say we haven't gone far enough by 10 points, while young men say we have gone too far by 9 points. So this isn't a settled issue by any stretch. And there's a sizable share of the electorate that is sympathetic to far-right claims that that society has overreached on this issue. Where the rhetoric really starts to stick with people is around transgender students, especially, as I said, when it's framed around sports and bathrooms. 2/3 of voters say it's a bad thing for the country when when students who are born as male are allowed to play on girls' sports teams or use girls' bathrooms. You can see by minus 57 points, they're more likely to say it's a bad thing. What you'd expect with Trump voters, but what I find more startling here is even looking at liberal Harris voters, we only have 22% saying it's a good thing, 30% saying it's a bad thing, and then you have a huge portion, almost 50%, saying it doesn't make a difference, so not really taking a position on this issue. And then the rest, moderate and conservative Harris voters, fall much more in line with believing that this is a bad thing. So this is a space where right-wing rhetoric connects not just with their base, but with a broader swath of the electorate. And we saw this several years ago in work we did with Page, with video testing, and it's still true today. And then Trump's claim that changing traditional gender definitions is a major problem resonates with 54% of voters. So this is, again, some fertile ground for right-wing messaging. When we shift that frame and we focus instead on transgender people's ability to live and express themselves freely, the conversation changes. We've tested this language in multiple places, and it consistently softens resistance and builds more support. And that key here is anchoring the message in that core American value that universally connects Americans of freedom. And when people feel that their values are being affirmed, when you start with that as an entry point, that softens their resistance, and they're less likely to see others' identities as a threat to them. It starts to open them up a little more. One of Trump's go-to othering tactics this past year has been attacking DEI. He's had a fair amount of success getting corporations, universities, others to fall in line. But diversity, equity, and inclusion are not dirty words to most Americans. The reality is there's a broad desire to respect people's differences and strong opposition specifically to erasing America's history of racial injustice. That's where his anti-DEI agenda really loses people, as you'll see. So at the start, I showed you the values that Americans say matter most to them when they rank their top ones. It's freedom, human rights, and democracy. Diversity and inclusion are much lower. But when you have the people rate them one by one, you can see people do support and believe that these are important values. Accepting differences is nearly universally important to people, strongly supported by Harris voters, independents, Trump voters. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, it's not just the left that believe that's important. Half of Trump voters rate these values as extremely or very important. These aren't fringe ideas. They're broadly held values. And even some voters, when they talk about diversity and inclusion, the people on the right, Trump voters want faith and Christianity and issues to be included in that, but the core principle of diversity and inclusion still resonates. And then when we look at values like tolerance, inclusion, diversity by age, the generational divide is clear. Voters under 30 rate all of these values nearly equally. They're all in on all three, whereas you start to see drop off among older voters when it comes to inclusion and diversity, but still very high numbers saying that these are important. When we ask directly how people feel about programs that support or promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, DEI, it's not a dirty word that Trump and Republicans want it to be. A majority of voters, 53%, view it favorably compared to just 26% unfavorable. Whether we say support or promote DEI didn't make a difference. We tested that. But there is a pretty sharp contrast with views on affirmative action, which is still a net positive, but there's a bunch of people, 40%, who are neutral or unsure. So there's just a lot more positivity towards goodwill and goodwill towards DEI. When you look at the subgroups on the right, that net Trump voters are similarly split on DEI and affirmative action. We kind of see them at similar net negatives, but Harris voters, independents across racial, ethnic groups support DEI. Much more positivity for DEI than for affirmative action. And these are all very comfortably in the net positive territory. Where right-wing rhetoric on othering is really likely to run afoul of voters is efforts to erase or censor the history of slavery and racism. And we asked about it here in public schools, but I don't think it would be different in another domain. But most Americans simply don't want to hide from our country's history. And the split test here, majorities of both Trump and Harris voters said teaching about slavery, racism, and past injustices is more of a good thing than a bad thing. And then when you look on the right side of the slide, we asked the flip side of this, and you have overwhelming majorities saying that it's a bad thing to remove lessons in textbooks that cover the history of slavery, racism, and past injustices in the US. So this is one of the few places where even Trump's base is not likely to follow him on this. He's way out over his skis on this. There are a few other opportunities to challenge Trump's coalition, places where his politics of othering create some real fractures, even among his own supporters. We do see that voters are growing tired of the division that Trump is fueling. 64% say he's doing more to divide the country than unite it. When we ask why, they point to immigration, deportation policies, and in general, his inflammatory rhetoric. That's an open-ended question. And that's not just the left that believes that. Outside of MAGA voters, most Americans, including half of non-MAGA Trump voters, see him as more of a divider. So his politics of othering is starting to wear thin. To dig deeper into how Trump's politics of othering divides people, we tested 10 specific statements and actions that Trump has taken. Harris voters overwhelmingly disapprove of these. So we're just going to focus here on the Trump voters, where he has potential to lose some of his base. And the clearest backlash he gets is from his attack on a Black congresswoman, calling her a low IQ person. It's the most offensive across the board. 40% of all Trump voters and 54% of non-MAGA Trump voters disapprove of this. And then even a notable share of MAGA Trump voters disapprove of it, though this would be very unlikely to turn them against him as a whole, but they don't like it. Other flashpoints include his claim that undocumented immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country, that especially alienates younger and non-MAGA Trump voters, and then his firing of the top 3 women in military leadership positions, which are part of his anti-DEI agenda, bother some of his voters. But other forms of his othering that we tested in the survey do find a receptive audience. So his rhetoric targeting transgender people or invoking Christianity to save our country, that did resonate with a lot of his own voters, and including some Harris voters. So we just saw Trump's removal of women from military leadership did raise concerns. Also, his pattern of attacks on women and women's rights are increasingly out of step, even with members of his own base. So these are results just among Trump voters. And you can see on the left, his own voters are more supportive of women's rights than you might have expected. Nearly half of Trump voters view the women's rights movements favorably. The strongest support is among non-MAGA Trump voters and those under age 50. And then looking at the right, we tested 2 statements. One claiming women are too focused on careers, and the other saying women's freedoms are under attack. Voters, when we look at voters overall, they overwhelmingly side with the freedom frame. But even Trump's base is divided on this. Majorities of younger and non-MAGA Trump voters rejected that idea of a return to traditional gender roles. And this kind of gender-based othering, it's long been a part of Trump's playbook, but there is backlash to it even among his own supporters. And then the last area I want to highlight here is Trump's use of Christianity to divide, rallying supporters around the Christian faith while pushing others out. Yes, Christian identity is important to many of his voters, but that doesn't mean that they want religion or the Christian religion to dictate government. We tested 2 statements, one saying Christian values should guide our laws, the other affirming the freedom of religion and separation of church and state. Voters overall break 70-30 for America was founded on freedom of religion, but his own voters, 56%, lean more towards protecting separation of church and state. This is another place where, and you can see if you look down here, the only group that really feels strongly that Christian values should guide our laws and government are white evangelical Trump voters. But within the rest of his base, there is more of a tension and openings to push back. And then finally, I want to talk about some ways to respond to the use of othering, which we're going to really go into in the 2nd and 3rd phases of the research. But it's very important to keep the focus on the economy and inequality, but that doesn't mean that we stay silent on cultural attacks and othering. There are real opportunities to push back, especially when we ground our message in core values that matter to people: family, faith, freedom. And just to underscore that point, when confronting othering, one of the most effective strategies from decades of psychological research is to connect to shared identity, a common in-group identity. So what do we all have in common across the board, from far left to swing voters to soft Trump voters? Family, consistency ranks as the most important part of personal identity. Faith and patriotism also show up as deeply held values. These are domains that Republicans have often tried to claim and used to divide, but they're not exclusively Republicans, and they're places where progressives and people on the left can connect and affirm those shared values and build that common ground. I know I've been talking about social and cultural issues because that's the focus of the research on the politics of othering. But to be clear, this isn't about saying Democrats should talk more about these issues. It's about understanding where Trump has lost some of his traction, where right-wing attacks are vulnerable, and how we can respond to those. Of course, Democrats need to talk more about the economy, the cost of living, wealth inequality. There's great work happening on that, including some of my colleagues at Heart, but we can't afford to cede cultural ground. And you can see when we ask, do you think the Democratic Party spends too much, right amount of time, or not enough time talking about different issues? 58% say not enough time talking about the economy and the cost of living. Just to be clear, Trump did very badly on this too. 57% said Trump doesn't spend enough time talking about the economy. But I just want to underscore this point that this is very important, but that doesn't mean you cede the narrative or go silent against some of these attacks. So to wrap up with a few big takeaways for those thinking about how to communicate effectively in the moment. First, root our messaging in shared values. Freedom, family, human rights are important across the electorate. These are important touchstones when you want to connect with people on that emotional level. Second, real frustration about shifting power in the country, especially that sense that working people are losing ground while the wealthy are consolidating more and more control. Speaking to that dynamic helps put the focus where it should be, and helps explain why people are being and feeling left behind. The third is we should keep affirming commitment to diversity, inclusion, and respect, and showing that respect for people's faith and traditional values is a part of that. Fourth, we can't be afraid to call out the far right's radical rejection of diversity and their efforts to marginalize anyone who doesn't fit into that narrow worldview. And then number 5 here is that while faith matters to many Americans, so does religious freedom. And most voters do support keeping church and state separate, and there's room to push back when the right tries to impose their version of religion through government power. The last set here, concerns about crime, border security are real for voters. They're not just code words or distractions, and we need to treat them as legitimate and address them directly without feeding into fear-based narratives. Number 7, Trump's immigration agenda is vulnerable, especially when it comes to deporting people who have lived here for years and built lives and contributed to their communities. Voters don't want to rip families apart without due process, and that's something that we should be emphasizing and leaning into when it happens. Number 8, many Americans feel uncertain about issues involving transgender people. It's just the reality of where we are, and especially when the conversation is about sports, kids' sports, and bathrooms. But Trump and the far right lose people when they start to go beyond policy and express personal disdain for people, or try and erase transgender people's right to exist or to express themselves freely. And then number 9, we have to stand firm for women's freedom, especially that freedom to make our own choices and lead in public life. The MAGA right is deeply out of step with the American public, and a place to very much go on defense and offense. So with that, thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Erica to help with the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Corey, and the entire Heart Research team. That was really, really fascinating. I am going to be helping surface some of the questions. Just as a reminder to folks, if you do have questions, drop them in the Q&A box, and our team is helping to sort through them. So I want to start off with one, just to kind of take a big picture view and talk about some of the patterns that you saw in the research. And I'm wondering if, based on those patterns, what you might say are the most significant drivers of this othering, right? Did you notice anything? Is economic factors? You talked about that a little bit as an approach, but economic factors, is media, geographic isolation, something else entirely that we might be missing? Did any of the patterns kind of surface what the underlying drivers of that othering are, or was it mostly focused just kind of on political strategy and the impact of the rhetoric? And that could be to any of you. I see Jeff and London also back on camera. So
Jeff, I thought I saw you come off mute.
Yeah. Well, Corey had a slide about what are the problems that people think are important. And, you know, we do, I think the concern around kind of immigration I think opens people's minds up to a lot of what Trump is saying, but we think there are, good ways of addressing that and kind of driving a wedge and with voters on his immigration pitch. People, uh, both Harris voters and Trump voters, just think that things are changing for the worse in the country, and they're looking for that they've lost power. Other people are gaining power at their expense. There's a different diagnosis of who's gaining power and who, instead of them. And but I think kind of this unhappiness with the power dynamic and the story that Trump tells his supporters about it is really kind of at the, very much at the heart of all of this. And we both want to attack Trump's othering at its points of weakness, and I think Corey laid those out really well. But we also need to tell a different story about kind of the changing power dynamic in the country. And, the good news there is that there's kind of, there is a consensus around this understanding that, working class people are losing power while the super wealthy and are gaining power. And the more that we can sort of focus on that piece of the explanation for what's going on in the country and this happiness that people are feeling, I think we're on stronger grounds to kind of succeed and win the argument.
Yeah. Oh, I would add from the driving perspective, just a psychological perspective that, people are inclined innately to categorize people into us versus them. That's kind of an automatic tendency, but it gets a lot worse when people feel under threat or don't feel a sense of control. And there's part of that happening very much with the economy and a sense of instability, but also a lack of control just of where the country is headed in many ways. And that people don't like to feel insecure or uncertain. That's very uncomfortable for people. And so they look for something to blame. When you can't fight against the most powerful, or you feel like that, it's not too hard to push people into just fighting for scraps. So I think it's authoritarian people can really exploit those predispositions and people's desire to have someone to blame, to give them just some sort of control or certainty, even though it's not real. It's just something that gives them a little bit of sense of security.
I think that speaks to another one of the questions that actually came in during the presentation. I might paraphrase it. So the question came in, are the differences between the Harris and Trump voters based on different factual information, or are they based on different goals for what they might want the country to be? And so my interpretation of that question is are they kind of substantive policy debates based on, again, we talk about filter bubbles in media and actually having differences of opinions on information, or is it actually a completely different vision for the country?
Corey, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Yeah, I would say it's both. This is, my lens that I see the world, but I think it starts from the values in the world view and their vision for what they see and desire for the country and just how they orient themselves towards the world. And we saw those sharp differences in their fundamental values, and how human rights were so much more of a concern for Harris voters. I think it starts there, but then I think information and the bubbles that you go into really reinforce that, because you're not being challenged. And people have confirmation bias and they seek out things that affirm their pre-existing point of views. And I think both of those come into play, but I do believe that part of it starts from some differences in people's worldviews.
Mhm, mhm. Um, to drill down into those differences, you all know that there's so much conversation happening now about young men. And in particular, there's some questions about the data around young men and the narrative, right, that young men are more conservative than young women. Is that true, first of all? But if so, and in your research, are you able to point to what is causing those differences and those gaps, right? So this question was about, is it about the erosion of reproductive freedom for women? Is it about, the perception by young men that young women are doing better in the world? Like, did your research point to any of the causes, is there any causation of the differences between young men and young women?
Well, one thing is I would encourage people to look at the deck that's on the PSG consulting website that is specifically about people under the age of 30. And our big takeaway from that deck is that they really have the potential to kind of be the vanguard in pushing back against the politics of othering, that they have very different view of the world than older people do. But you'll also see in that deck that there are substantial differences between men and women, particularly between white men and white women. Um, I think in part because younger women are much more likely to have communitarian values than white men do, and think about the kind of who's winning and who's losing in a slightly different way. Um,
Mhm.
but Corey, you've really taken a look at the younger white men.
Yeah, and London, you should also jump in with any additional thoughts. One of the things that stood out to me in looking at the data on young people is how disconnected young men were from society on many different ways. Like they rated each of the values as less important for their own personal identity. They cared less about all the problems we asked about on the right and the left. There's, I think, a sense of being disconnected from society. They are more conservative than young women without question, but I would also add that they are more progressive than older men. So there is a very clear, I think, gender divide. And for me, one of the things that just stands out is this sort of disconnection from society, this distance that is happening. And I think that can make you, when you don't have like a center or something to hold on to or connect to, can make you more vulnerable to that, because people want meaning in their lives, and they want explanations. And when you're feeling discontent and there's nothing to hold on to, and someone offers you something, I think that you have a greater opportunity to connect. And so I do think that makes them a little more vulnerable.
Now, a lot of these questions thus far have been about the why, right? Why are we seeing this divide? What is driving the othering? As people who do this work all the time, my question would be, what in your research did you find surprising? Were there any divides, or on a more positive note, any kind of similarities or smaller gaps than you thought might exist that point to, some hope that point to some things that maybe you weren't expecting going in?
I think that I think we come out of this more hopeful than not. That obviously there are substantial differences between people on the left and people on the right, people who voted for Harris and people who voted for Trump. But what we tried to document in kind of in the deck that Corey went through is that there are a lot of places where we can connect with Trump voters, that they are not all a lost cause, particularly the ones who don't think of themselves as kind of being part of the MAGA movement, but even some of the MAGAs, and that that Trump is in the wrong place on his attack on tolerance and diversity, on erasing our history, on attacks on the role of women. In that very first slide, it's true that Harris voters are much more likely than Trump voters to care about human rights, but 50% of Trump voters say that human rights are kind of very important to them. I mean, I think they may kind of list a different set of rights than Harris voters, but um, but we come out of this feeling that there are a whole series of ways where we can both try to connect with Trump voters, and more importantly, try to disconnect Trump voters from Trump and Trump's politics of othering, where people just feel like he's taking it way too far, taking it in ugly places, taking it in ways that don't connect with their values. And that was most of what those final two slides were intended to outline.
So last question, and this came in, and I think it's a great segue also as we toss back to Paige to kind of summarize some of what we've covered today, but it's about the future of this research. And someone asked, are you considering using this in more advanced analysis to identify segments of the population and then, figure out some primary and supporting messages that might work for them? So is there any message testing involved or research around that planned?
Corey, do you want to talk about the next phases of the research?
Yeah, to the first point on segmentation, that's something we did in a round of othering research several years ago, and found it very interesting, and are interested in doing it again too. I would say it wasn't dramatically different, like the takeaways weren't dramatically different than anything we said today, and I don't expect them to be, but it's always interesting to look into as to the next phases of research beyond just continuing to analyze this current data set. Want to do qualitative with younger voters, both men and women, but really I'm particularly interested in this idea that younger men not feeling connected or centered by anything. What did we miss in this survey that they are connected to that we haven't asked about? And that's something you can really only uncover when you talk directly to people, but also testing actual stimuli, videos, clips, social media, and getting people's reactions to different real world executions of othering in practice. What connects with them? Where do they have resistance? And also start to test some responses to it. So there's visual or media component to seeing how people react to different media. And then we also wanted to do an experimental test, which Paige, I don't know if you want to explain more, but it's again, more messaging response, because this was very much diagnostic. And then we want to build into understanding some of these phenomenon more deeply and testing messaging responses as well.
Yeah, Paige, I think I'll let you do that. And then no, I was going to toss to you and then say, I think this has been a great conversation, and I'll let you wrap from there.
Okay, thanks. We do want to continue this in 3 ways, which is, as Corey mentioned and others have mentioned, a huge qualitative piece to this research, really listening to people, different types of people, and then going and doing a simulation with video and as if you're in a real campaign and a back and forth. But most importantly, we really do want to run pilot programs with real voters in areas in the country and targeting people in the country that are so, susceptible to this othering, and figuring out if we can counter it, but not only counter it, make it costly to people who engage in it. So we are very hopeful to be able to continue this research because it is so foundational to the division in the country today.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for this amazing conversation. Thank you, Jeff, Corey, and London. And then Paige, I'll let you close us out.
All right, I just want to thank people who have really allowed us to do this support and thank the Heart team for their really brilliant work. So thank you, and hopefully we'll be showing other results soon.